The rope hangs against the cliff face like a question mark, its hemp fibers darkened by rain, and something else that Private Martinez doesn't want to think about. Below him, 70 feet down the sheer rock of Hacksaw Ridge, medics move like shadows in the grey dawn light, their stretchers arranged in neat rows that tell a story no one wants to read. Above, on the plateau where the 77th Infantry Division clings to positions that feel more like graves than tactical advantages, the intermittent crack of sniper fire reminds everyone that the Japanese are still watching, still waiting. Martinez tests the knot one more time, his hands shaking not from the cold April rain, but from what he's about to do. Lower another broken body down this impossible cliff, while mortars walk across the ridge behind him, each explosion a reminder that he should have been gone an hour ago. The order came down at 0500. Pull back, regroup, let artillery soften the position before the next assault. But orders don't account for the 11 wounded men scattered across the muddy crater above, and they certainly don't account for Desmond Doss. "You sure about this rope, Doc?" Martinez calls over his shoulder, where Doss kneels beside Corporal Chen, wrapping a torn undershirt around the 19-year-old's eyes with the gentleness of a father tucking in a child. "It'll hold," Doss says, his voice carrying that strange calm that has kept Martinez sane for the past 3 hours. "Trust the rope. Trust me. Trust God." In that order. The blindfold carry started as pure improvisation, born from Chen's hysteria when he caught sight of the drop. Now it's become routine, though Doss never does it exactly the same way twice. Sometimes a field bandage across the eyes, sometimes his own helmet positioned to block the view, sometimes just his steady voice telling the wounded to close their eyes and let someone else see for them. The men have started requesting it, not because they're all blinded by shrapnel, but because something about Doss's presence, his refusal to let them face the terror alone, makes the impossible descent bearable. Martinez remembers 3 hours ago when this nightmare began as a routine patrol to clear remaining Japanese positions before the main assault. The 77th had been grinding across Okinawa for weeks, each ridge a new kind of hell, but Hacksaw Ridge felt different from the moment they crested the plateau. The machine gun nests were too well concealed, the mortars too precisely ranged. Within minutes, half the platoon was scattered across the killing field, and the survivors were rappelling down rope lines that suddenly felt too thin, too few, too temporary. Lieutenant Harrison had made the call that any reasonable officer would make. "Everyone back down, we'll get them in the morning." But morning meant another assault, more casualties, and no guarantee the wounded would survive another night exposed on the ridge. When the last able-bodied soldier disappeared over the cliff edge, Doss remained behind, checking his medical kit and testing knots with the methodical precision of a man who had already decided what orders he would follow and which ones he would quietly ignore. "Ready, Chen?" Doss's voice carries that tone Martinez has heard him use a dozen times now, gentle but absolutely certain. "We're just taking a little trip. Hold the rope and think about home." Chen nods against his improvised blindfold, his lips moving in what might be prayer or might be his mother's name. At 19, he's old enough to understand exactly how far 70 feet is, old enough to know that rope burns through flesh, and that Japanese snipers have been tracking this particular anchor point for the past hour. But something about Doss's hands, steady and sure as they guide the rope around Chen's chest, transforms terror into trust. The descent takes forever and no time at all. Martinez feeds rope through his bleeding palms, timing his movements to the rhythm of incoming mortar rounds, using the explosions to mask the scrape of hemp against rock. Halfway down, Chen's eyes must have shifted behind the blindfold, catching a glimpse of empty air because his whole body goes rigid with panic. But Doss is already talking, his voice carrying clearly down the cliff face. "Still there, Chen. Skies still blue above you, ground's getting closer below. Your mother's going to hear you made it home. When Chen reaches the bottom and the medics pull him clear, Martinez allows himself 30 seconds to wonder if he's losing his mind. 11 men lowered to safety in one night, using nothing but rope and prayer and strips torn from their own uniforms. His hands are raw meat wrapped around hemp fibers that should have snapped hours ago. His throat is hoarse from calling instructions down the cliff face, and somewhere behind him on the ridge, Doss is already moving toward the next wounded soldier, his medical kit nearly empty, but his resolve somehow growing stronger with each impossible rescue. The sound of Japanese voices echoes up from the caves below, and Martinez realizes they've been watching this entire operation unfold. Enemy soldiers, exhausted and entrenched, following their own desperate orders in this same brutal landscape. For reasons he can't explain, this makes him feel worse, not better. They're all trapped on this ridge together. American, Japanese, wounded, dying. And the only thing moving freely between them is one unarmed medic who refuses to acknowledge that some things are impossible. As dawn breaks fully over Okinawa and the rain continues to fall, Martinez prepares for what might be their final descent. The rope is fraying badly, weakened by constant use and enemy fire. His own exhaustion makes every movement clumsy and uncertain. But Private Williams, the last wounded man on the ridge, watches Doss approach with absolute trust, even though shrapnel has torn through his throat and stolen his voice. Williams can't speak, but his eyes follow every movement as Doss tears the last clean strip from his undershirt and approaches with the familiar routine that has become their liturgy of survival. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The thing about Hacksaw Ridge that no training manual could prepare them for is the sound. Not just the obvious percussion of mortars and machine guns, but the way voices carry across the coral rock, wounded men calling for their mothers in 3 languages, Japanese soldiers shouting coordinates from hidden positions, and underneath it all, the constant scrape of rope against stone as Doss continues his impossible work. Lieutenant Harrison crouches in a shell crater 40 yards from the rope anchor, his radio crackling with demands for updates he doesn't know how to provide. How do you explain to battalion that your platoon medic has been lowering wounded men over a cliff for 4 hours straight, using equipment that should have failed after the first rescue? How do you report that the same man who wouldn't carry a rifle during basic training is now the only reason 11 soldiers aren't bleeding out under Japanese fire? Doss? Harrison calls through cupped hands. Time to go. That's an order. The medic looks up from where he's preparing Williams for descent, his face streaked with mud and exhaustion, but his hands still steady as he ties another improvised blindfold. Just one more, Lieutenant. Williams here has been waiting patient as a saint. Harrison has been giving orders for 18 months since Normandy, and he knows the difference between insubordination and something else entirely. Doss isn't defying authority. He's following a different chain of command, one that runs directly from wounded soldiers to his own conscience without stopping at rank structure. The lieutenant has court-martialed men for less, but watching Williams trust as Doss guides the rope around his chest, Harrison finds himself hoping the rope holds for one final descent. The Japanese have stopped firing at the anchor point, and that should feel like relief, but instead feels ominous. Sergeant Watanabe, hidden in a cave system 30 meters from the American position, has been watching this strange ritual unfold through his field glasses. One man, moving with deliberate calm between wounded soldiers, clearly unarmed but somehow drawing no fire from positions that have been ordered to shoot anything that moves. Watanabe's own orders are clear: defend the ridge, inflict maximum casualties, hold until death. But something about the American medic's methodical work gives him pause. "Should we target the rope?" asks the machine gunner beside him, a boy barely older than the Americans being lowered down the cliff. Watanabe considers this. The rope is an easy target, clearly visible against the dark rock. Cutting it would kill whoever is descending and trap the medic above. It would be tactically sound, strategically justified, exactly what his training demands. Instead, he finds himself saying, "Hold fire, watch and wait." Back on the ridge, Doss has completed his final blindfold carry. Williams descended into the grey dawn without a sound, his wounded throat unable to voice the gratitude that showed clearly in his eyes. The makeshift pulley system, rigged between a splintered tree stump and Doss's own belt, finally gives way as the last weight disappears over the cliff edge. The rope falls slack, its fibers too damaged for another descent, and Doss realizes he's trapped himself on the plateau with the very equipment he used to save everyone else. Harrison approaches with careful steps, as if moving too quickly might break whatever spell has kept them alive this long. The ridge is eerily quiet now, just the distant sound of rain and the occasional crack of settling debris. The wounded have been evacuated, the able-bodied soldiers are safely below, and the two of them remain on ground that should have been abandoned hours ago. "Doc," Harrison says quietly, "how do we get you down?" Doss looks over the cliff edge where his rope hangs in useless tatters, 70 feet of empty air between him and safety, with Japanese positions on 3 sides and nowhere to run if the enemy decides to end this temporary ceasefire. He should be terrified, should be calculating angles and odds and desperate alternatives. Instead, he finds himself thinking about the faces of the men he lowered, Chen's grateful tears, William's silent trust, Martinez's steady hands feeding rope, despite his own terror. "Same way I got up, Lieutenant," Doss says with a tired smile. "One step at a time. The solution comes from an unexpected source." A new rope drops from somewhere above. Thick and military issue, clearly not the frayed hemp they've been using all night. Harrison looks up to see faces peering over the cliff edge. Soldiers from the 77th 2nd Platoon, men who heard about the medic on the radio and climbed the long way around to establish a new anchor point. They'd been moving for hours, navigating Japanese patrols and mortar fire, driven by reports that seemed too impossible to believe. "Coming down," called Sergeant Murphy from above. "Medics got priority on the first descent," but Doss is already shaking his head, checking his empty medical kit and looking back across the plateau where morning light reveals details that darkness had hidden. Blood trails leading to positions he hasn't checked, drag marks suggesting wounded men pulled to cover he hasn't searched. The terrible possibility that his count was wrong, that just one more might actually mean just one more. "Lieutenant goes first," Doss calls up to Murphy. "I need to make sure we didn't miss anyone." Harrison starts to protest, then stops. He's seen enough of Desmond Doss to know that arguing is pointless. The medic will search every shell crater and cave mouth on this ridge before he'll accept rescue, and no amount of orders will change that. Instead, Harrison does something that 18 months of combat leadership never prepared him for. He trusts a private's judgment over his own tactical assessment. 5 minutes, Doc," Harrison says as he clips into the new rope. "Then you're coming down, whether you found anyone or not." As the lieutenant disappears over the cliff edge, Doss begins his final search of Hacksaw Ridge. The plateau is smaller than it felt in the darkness, maybe 40 yards across, cratered and torn by weeks of artillery, but still recognizably the high ground that cost so much to take. He moves methodically, checking every depression and overhang, his empty hands strange after hours of gripping rope and guiding wounded men. In a shell crater near the ridge's eastern edge, partially hidden by fallen debris, Doss finds what he was afraid he might find. Private Yamamoto has been unconscious for most of the night, bleeding slowly from shrapnel wounds that would have been survivable with immediate treatment. Now, as Okinawa's dawn light reveals the full extent of the damage, Doss kneels beside a Japanese soldier who can't be older than 18, his uniform torn and his breathing shallow but steady. The enemy they've been fighting for weeks, reduced to one wounded boy who never chose this ridge, this war, this moment of impossible decision. Doss's hands move automatically, checking pulse and pupil response. cataloguing injuries with the clinical precision that transcends nationality and uniform. 2 major lacerations, probable concussion, significant blood loss but stable vitals. Treatable if he had supplies. Survivable if he could get the boy down the cliff. The problem isn't medical, it's everything else. From the new rope line, Sergeant Murphy's voice carries across the plateau. "DOS! Time's up. You coming or staying permanent?" The medic looks down at the unconscious Japanese soldier, then back at the cliff edge where American voices grow more insistent. His medical kit is empty, his strength nearly exhausted, and his own survival depends on reaching that rope in the next 60 seconds. Standard operating procedure is clear. Enemy wounded are not his responsibility. Field Manual 8-50 is explicit about priorities. His oath as a medic technically applies only to American personnel. But when Yamamoto's eyes flutter open and focus on DOS, with the universal look of pain seeking relief, technical distinctions collapse into something simpler. A wounded 18-year-old boy, afraid and far from home, looking up at someone who might help or might kill him, and having no choice but to wait for the verdict. DOS tears another strip from his already shredded undershirt and begins wrapping Yamamoto's head wound. The Japanese soldier flinches, then lies still as gentle hands work with the same care that guided Chen and Williams and 9 other Americans through their own moments of helpless trust. No shared language, no common ground, except the wordless understanding that passes between wounded and healer. From his position in the cave system, Sergeant Watanabe watches this development through field glasses with growing confusion. The American medic, alone and surrounded, is treating a Japanese soldier with the same methodical attention he showed his own wounded. Either the American has lost his mind, or he's following orders that make no tactical sense, or he's operating according to principles that exist outside the normal framework of war entirely. "What's he doing?" asked the young machine gunner. "I don't know," Watanabe admits. In his 3 years of fighting from the Philippines to Okinawa, he has never seen anything like this. American soldiers who treat prisoners correctly sometimes. Enemy medics who provide basic first aid under flag of truce occasionally. But an unarmed man, alone and exposed, spending precious time treating wounds that, strategically, should remain untreated. On the cliff edge, Murphy is running out of patience and options. Radio chatter indicates Japanese reinforcements moving toward the ridge from multiple directions. Higher command wants all American personnel clear of the area before the next artillery barrage softens the position for another assault. Every minute DOS spends on the plateau increases the risk for everyone involved. "DOS!" Murphy shouts. "I'm coming to get you." "Stay put, Sergeant," comes the reply. "I've got wounded up here." American wounded. A pause that stretches long enough for Murphy to understand the answer before it's spoken. "Wounded," he hears across the plateau. "Give me 2 more minutes." Murphy faces the same impossible choice that has been haunting every soldier who's worked with Desmond DOS. Follow regulations that make tactical sense, or trust a medic whose actions consistently transcend normal military logic. The sergeant has never disobeyed a direct order, never questioned command decisions, never found himself weighing doctrine against the testimony of his own eyes. But watching DOS work on that ridge, hearing the calm certainty in his voice, Murphy finds himself buying time he doesn't have for reasons he can't explain. Yamamoto regains consciousness slowly, his eyes focusing on DOS with the gradual recognition that this American soldier is not reaching for a weapon. The medic's hands are empty except for improvised bandages, his approach careful but not threatening. When DOS helps him sit up and offers water from his own canteen, Yamamoto accepts with the bewildered gratitude of someone whose expectations have been completely overturned. The Japanese soldier speaks, a few words that DOS doesn't understand, but recognizes as either thanks or apology or prayer. Maybe all 3. Doss responds with his own incomprehensible English. "You're going to be fine, son. Just need to get you somewhere safe." He repeats it in the tone that guided 11 American soldiers through their own blindfold carries, gentle and absolutely certain, as if repetition could create understanding across the language barrier. The problem is the cliff. Yamamoto is conscious but weak, able to sit but not to rappel. The new rope system assumes strength and cooperation that the wounded Japanese soldier simply doesn't possess. Doss considers his options. Leave the boy to bleed out slowly in the shell crater, attempt an impossible rescue that might kill them both, or find some third alternative that exists outside his current tactical imagination. The answer comes from Yamamoto himself, who points toward the plateau's eastern edge with surprising urgency. Following his gesture, Doss discovers what local knowledge reveals, a narrow path, barely 18 inches wide, that switchbacks down the cliff face through natural rock formations. Not visible from below, almost invisible from above, but wide enough for careful movement by someone who knows exactly where to step. Yamamoto struggles to his feet, swaying but determined, and begins leading Doss along the hidden path with the slow precision of someone navigating familiar ground. The Japanese soldier knows this ridge, has probably used this route before, and is now guiding his supposed enemy towards safety through terrain that American maps never showed. From his cave position, Watanabe watches the medic and the wounded soldier disappear along the eastern cliff face, moving carefully but steadily toward positions held by neither side. He could radio their location, direct fire onto the narrow path, eliminate both men with a single burst. His duty is clear, his orders explicit. Instead, he finds himself checking his watch and calculating how long the pair will need to reach neutral ground. "Should we report this?" asks the machine gunner. Watanabe considers what he would say in such a report. That an American medic treated Japanese wounded, that his own position allowed interdiction, but he chose not to act. That sometimes the war contains moments too strange for normal tactical response. None of these facts would improve his standing with command. "Radio silence," he says finally. "Equipment malfunction. We saw nothing. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." The path down the eastern face of Hacksaw Ridge exists in a geography that war maps never anticipated, too narrow for tactical movement, too exposed for normal military use, but wide enough for one wounded soldier guided by another who refuses to abandon anyone, regardless of uniform. Yamamoto moves with the careful precision of someone navigating familiar ground, each step calculated to compensate for weakness and pain, while Doss follows with the improvised confidence of a man who has already committed to impossible actions. 20 feet down the cliff face, the path widens into a natural ledge where previous rainfall has carved shallow handholds into the coral rock. Yamamoto pauses here, breathing heavily, and for the first time since regaining consciousness seems fully aware of what's happening. An American medic, alone and unarmed, following a Japanese soldier down a secret path, while both armies wait for something that makes tactical sense. Doss checks Yamamoto's bandages, which are holding despite the movement, and offers water again from his nearly empty canteen. The Japanese soldier accepts, drinks carefully, then speaks in hesitant English that suggests classroom learning rather than battlefield necessity. "Why?" Yamamoto asks, the single word carrying the weight of questions too complex for his limited vocabulary. Doss considers how to answer. Why treat enemy wounded? Why risk court-martial for insubordination? Why follow wounded soldiers down impossible cliff faces instead of accepting reasonable orders to withdraw and regroup? The honest answer involves faith, conscience, and a refusal to calculate human worth in tactical terms. But those concepts require shared language and time they don't have. "Same reason you'd help me," Doss says simply, then demonstrates by checking Yamamoto's pulse again with the same gentle precision he used for Chen and Williams. The descent continues through terrain that exists outside normal military categories. Not American-held, not Japanese-controlled, but temporarily neutral ground where wounded soldiers help each other navigate toward positions that neither side has thought to contest. Halfway down, they encounter evidence that others have used this path. Scratches in the rock that suggest previous emergency descents, dried blood that could be from either army, and small offerings left in rock crevices that speak to the human need for ritual, even in impossible places. At the bottom of the ridge, the path emerges into a narrow gully that runs parallel to both American and Japanese positions, without being clearly visible from either. Yamamoto knows this terrain, has probably moved through it during previous operations, and now leads Doss toward what appears to be a small cave system that offers temporary shelter. Not safety, nowhere on Okinawa qualifies as safe in April 1945, but a place to rest and plan whatever comes next. Inside the largest cave, they discover they are not the first to find this sanctuary. Medical supplies, both American and Japanese, are cached in natural alcoves, along with water containers and basic food stores. Someone at some point decided this neutral ground should serve wounded from both armies, creating an unofficial aid station that exists outside the normal structure of military medicine. Yamamoto gestures toward the American supplies and speaks in careful English. "For you friends, before, other medic." Doss understands gradually. Other American medics have found this place, treated wounded here, left supplies for whoever might need them next. The cache represents an underground network of medical personnel who prioritize healing over tactical advantage, creating systems that exist parallel to official command structures. He's not the first to make these impossible choices. He's just the latest to discover that others have been quietly making them all along. Using the cached supplies, Doss treats Yamamoto's wounds properly for the first time, cleaning and suturing with equipment that his own kit hadn't contained for hours. The Japanese soldier submits to treatment with the passive trust that Doss recognizes from 11 previous patients, regardless of nationality. Pain and relief transcend language barriers. Gratitude requires no translation. While working, Doss discovers other evidence of the cave's history. American dog tags left by soldiers who didn't survive their wounds. Japanese personal effects placed carefully in small shrines. Photographs of families, some Asian, some American, arranged around a natural altar where water seeps constantly from the cave ceiling. This space has become something unprecedented in Doss's military experience, a place where war temporarily stops. Yamamoto recovers enough strength to speak more freely, his classroom English improving under necessity. He explains that he was a medical student before conscription, trained in basic field treatment, assigned to his unit because they needed someone with surgical knowledge. Not a career soldier, not an ideological warrior, just a 19-year-old who understood anatomy and found himself treating wounds instead of studying them. Same, he says, gesturing between himself and Doss. Help people, not kill people. The irony isn't lost on either of them. Two medics, trained by opposing armies, meeting in neutral ground created by the accumulated choices of other medical personnel who refuse to let tactical considerations override human need. They've been fighting the same war from opposite sides, following the same conscience along parallel paths that finally converged on Hacksaw Ridge. Outside the cave, both American and Japanese patrols are moving through the area, searching for survivors and preparing for the next phase of operations. Radio chatter, audible from both directions, indicates that official reports are being filed, casualties tallied, equipment losses calculated. Neither army knows about the cave system or the men inside, creating a temporary pocket of unmilitary time where healing proceeds without tactical oversight. Doss realizes that returning to American lines means explaining why he spent hours treating enemy wounded instead of following direct orders to evacuate. Yamamoto faces the same problem from the opposite direction, explaining to Japanese command why he accepted treatment from an enemy medic instead of dying appropriately for the emperor. Both men are caught between conscience and duty, between what they did and what their respective armies expected them to do. The solution emerges gradually through broken conversation and shared understanding. Yamamoto will remain in the cave system, which connects to other neutral spaces throughout the ridge complex. He can survive here, treat other wounded who find this sanctuary, and contribute to the underground network of medical personnel operating outside normal command structures. Doss will return to American lines with evidence that he spent his time searching for additional American wounded, which is technically true, even if it omits crucial details. Before leaving, Doss adds his own contribution to the cave's medical supplies and leaves a brief note for whoever might find it next. For wounded soldiers, any uniform. D. Doss, 77th Infantry Division. Simple words that acknowledge the truth both men have discovered. Some obligations transcend tactical considerations, and healing is allegiance enough. The truth that Desmond Doss never told the reporters, never mentioned in interviews, never included in his quiet conversations with chaplains, sits in his chest like a second heartbeat 40 years after Hacksaw Ridge. Not the dramatic truth they wanted, how it felt to lower wounded men down a cliff under enemy fire, but the smaller, more complicated truth of those hours in the cave, with a Japanese medic who spoke broken English and shared water from the same canteen. In his small Tennessee home, Doss sits at his kitchen table with morning coffee and hands that still show scars from rope burns, reading another letter from someone who wants to write a book about his war service. They all ask the same questions. How did you find the courage? What gave you strength? How did faith sustain you through impossible circumstances? The answers they want involve divine intervention and unwavering conviction, clean narratives that transform human complexity into inspirational simplicity. What they don't ask, and what Doss has never volunteered, is whether he ever doubted, whether fear sometimes paralyzed him completely, whether the certainty that carried him through 11 rope descents was actually careful performance, repeated prayers that created the illusion of confidence he needed to function, whether treating Yamamoto in that cave forced him to confront questions about duty, loyalty, and the boundaries of conscience that 40 years haven't fully resolved. The rope that lowered Chen and Williams and 9 other Americans to safety also lowered Doss's previous understanding of who qualified for his mercy. Before Yamamoto, medical triage was simple. Treat American wounded first, enemy wounded second if supplies and time permitted, civilians third if circumstances allowed. Clear priorities that reflected training, doctrine, and the practical necessities of battlefield medicine. Encountering a wounded Japanese soldier alone on the ridge, with no oversight and no guidelines, forced him to discover what he actually believed rather than what he'd been taught to believe. In the cave, watching Yamamoto work with cached medical supplies to treat his own wounds, Doss confronted the possibility that his convictions were either much larger than he'd imagined or much smaller than he'd claimed. Either healing transcended all tactical categories, nationality, uniform, strategic value, or it was just another form of military procedure dressed in spiritual language. The choice between those interpretations shaped every decision for the rest of his life. The secret he's never shared is how long he hesitated before helping Yamamoto down the cliff face. Standing over an unconscious enemy soldier, Doss experienced 30 seconds of complete moral paralysis. His training said leave and report the position for capture later. His orders said evacuate American personnel only. His safety said avoid contact with enemy wounded who might be armed or booby-trapped. His conscience said, treat wounds regardless of uniform. For 30 seconds, that felt like 30 minutes, Desmond Doss stood frozen between competing loyalties, discovering that absolute conviction was actually moment-by-moment choice, repeated until it becomes habit. The rope didn't lower itself. The blindfolds didn't tie themselves. The wounded didn't guide themselves to safety. Each action required a separate decision to continue following conscience instead of convenience. And some of those decisions came much harder than others. Yamamoto's gratitude, expressed in careful English and small gestures, forced Doss to confront another uncomfortable truth. He hadn't treated the Japanese soldier purely from altruistic motives. Part of him was curious whether enemy wounded would respond with the same trust he'd seen from American casualties. Part of him wanted to prove something about his own principles, to test whether his convictions remained consistent under circumstances that his training hadn't anticipated. The discovery that healing felt identical, regardless of the patient's nationality, was both reassuring and troubling. Reassuring because it confirmed that his medical calling transcended tactical considerations. Troubling because it suggested that nationalism, unit loyalty, and military identity were thinner than he'd assumed. If wounded soldiers were just wounded soldiers, what did that mean about the entire framework of armies, enemies, and justified violence? In the cave, sharing water and medical supplies with someone who'd been shooting at Americans 12 hours earlier, Doss experienced a moment of complete conceptual vertigo. The war suddenly made no sense, not because the strategic objectives were unclear, but because the human similarities across uniform boundaries were too obvious to ignore. Yamamoto missed his family, feared death, wanted to heal people instead of killing them, remove the language barrier and uniform differences, and he could have been any American medic Doss had served with. This realization created the crisis that Doss has never discussed with anyone. If enemy soldiers were essentially identical to American soldiers, what justified the entire enterprise of war? His Seventh-day Adventist convictions had resolved the question of personal violence. He would not kill, but hadn't prepared him for the more complex question of whether healing enemy wounded constituted a form of treason or the highest expression of religious duty. The cached medical supplies in the cave suggested that other medics, both American and Japanese, had faced similar moral confusion and reached similar conclusions. Someone had decided that wounded soldiers deserved treatment regardless of tactical affiliation. Someone had created an unofficial network that prioritized healing over military effectiveness. Doss was not pioneering new moral territory. He was discovering a tradition of medical conscience that existed parallel to official command structures. This knowledge was simultaneously comforting and isolating. Comforting because it meant he wasn't alone in his convictions. Isolating because it meant he was part of an underground community that his own army might consider subversive. Treating enemy wounded wasn't just personal conscience, it was participation in a shadow medical system that undermined normal military categories. The rope that brought him safely down from Hacksaw Ridge also carried him into 40 years of wondering whether he'd been a hero, a traitor, or simply a confused young man whose training proved inadequate for the moral complexity he encountered. The citations and medals assumed clear categories: American good, enemy bad, healing allies virtuous, healing enemies problematic. His actual experience suggested that the categories were arbitrary and that conscience operated in more complicated territory than official recognition could accommodate. Finishing his morning coffee, Doss folds the interview request and files it with dozens of others he's declined. The story they want to tell involves divine guidance and unwavering faith. The story he actually lived involved moment-by-moment confusion, moral improvisation, and the gradual discovery that healing wounded soldiers was either much simpler or much more complicated than anyone had prepared him to understand. The nightmares started 3 weeks after Doss returned stateside, not during the combat itself, but in the quiet safety of a military hospital bed where his mind finally had space to process what his body had simply endured. Not the dramatic nightmares of incoming mortars or sniper fire, but quiet dreams of rope burning through his hands, while voices called for help from distances he couldn't judge. Sometimes the voices spoke English, sometimes Japanese, sometimes languages he didn't recognize. Always in the dream, he was choosing which voice to answer first, and always someone died while he was helping someone else. The Medal of Honor ceremony in October 1945 felt like receiving recognition for someone else's actions. President Truman's words described a heroic narrative that resembled Doss's memories, the way official photographs resemble lived experience. Technically accurate but missing the uncertainty, confusion, and moral improvisation that shaped every decision. The citation mentioned lowering wounded men to safety but omitted the 30-second paralysis before helping Yamamoto, the exhaustion that nearly made him abandon Williams, the cave system where American and Japanese supplies were cached together. Captain Morrison, who had recommended Doss for the decoration, approached him after the ceremony with questions that suggested he understood the gap between official recognition and actual experience. "How are you sleeping, Doss? How are your hands? How's your family handling the attention?" Practical questions that acknowledge the human cost of extraordinary service, the weight that accumulated in minds and bodies long after the tactical situation resolved. "Fine, sir," Doss replied, because admitting otherwise would require explanations that he wasn't prepared to provide. How could he explain that he sometimes startled awake reaching for rope that wasn't there? That the smell of wet hemp in his Tennessee backyard could trigger complete sensory return to the ridge? That he found himself treating every minor injury, neighbor's cut hand, brother's sprained ankle, with the same gentle precision he'd used in life-or-death situations, as if he'd forgotten how to calibrate care to circumstances. The interview requests came steadily for decades, from reporters and authors who wanted to understand how faith sustained courage under impossible circumstances. Doss developed standard responses that satisfied questioners without revealing the complexity that wouldn't fit into inspirational narratives. Yes, prayer had been essential. Yes, his convictions remained firm. Yes, he would do it again if necessary. All true statements that omitted the parts of truth that couldn't be easily categorized or comfortably absorbed. What he never mentioned was the letter he received in 1963, 18 years after the war, forwarded through Veterans Administration channels from someone who signed himself simply Y. Yamamoto, Hiroshima Medical College. Written in careful English, the letter thanked Doss for treatment received during difficult circumstances on Okinawa and reported that the sender had completed medical training and was practicing pediatric surgery. No details about the cave, no references to the cached supplies, just acknowledgement that one moment of choosing conscience over convenience had reverberations that lasted decades. Yamamoto's letter created a crisis that Doss never shared with anyone. Not his wife, not his pastor, not the chaplains who occasionally visited to discuss his wartime spiritual experiences. Reading evidence that the Japanese soldier had survived and was now healing children forced him to confront a question he'd been avoiding. How many other lives had been indirectly saved by his decision to treat enemy wounded? How many patients would Yamamoto help throughout his career because one American medic had chosen healing over tactical calculation? The mathematics were impossible, but inescapable. Every child Yamamoto treated, every life his surgical skills preserved, traced back partly to that moment of choosing compassion over convenience on Hacksaw Ridge. Doss's decision to treat one enemy soldier had possibly saved hundreds of lives across decades, but accepting credit for that extended impact meant accepting responsibility for its opposite. Every person he might have saved by following orders instead of conscience. This moral complexity was too heavy for Medal of Honor narratives, too ambiguous for inspirational speeches, too personal for public recognition. It belonged in the category of experience that veterans carried privately, shared only with others who understood that heroic actions had consequences that extended far beyond official citations and public ceremonies. In 1987, 42 years after Hacksaw Ridge, Doss received another letter forwarded through medical channels. Dr. Y. Yamamoto, now Chief of Pediatric Surgery at Hiroshima Medical College, was writing to inform him that a memorial garden was being established on Okinawa to honor medical personnel from both armies who had treated wounded soldiers regardless of nationality. Doss's name was listed among American contributors to this underground tradition of healing that had operated parallel to official command structures throughout the Pacific Campaign. The Memorial Garden concept suggested that what happened in the cave wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of medical conscience that both armies had quietly tolerated. Other medics, both American and Japanese, had made similar choices throughout the war, creating an informal network that prioritized healing over tactical advantage. Doss was not a unique moral pioneer. He was a representative example of medical personnel who refused to let military categories completely override human categories. This knowledge was both humbling and liberating. Humbling because it meant his actions weren't as unprecedented as recognition suggested. Liberating because it meant he'd been part of a community of conscience that transcended national boundaries and military structures. The rope that lowered wounded soldiers to safety had been held by many hands, guided by many voices, anchored by many people who chose healing over convenience when circumstances forced the choice. At 87, sitting in his Tennessee home with morning coffee and hands that still show rope scars, Doss finally understands what he couldn't articulate during decades of interviews. The Medal of Honor recognized his courage, but the real measure of his service was quieter and more complicated. The discovery that healing wounded soldiers, regardless of uniform, was both the most natural thing in the world and the most subversive thing he ever did. The rope still hangs in his dreams sometimes, not as nightmare, but as reminder. Voices still call for help from distances he can't judge, and he still chooses which voice to answer first. The difference is that now, 40 years later, he knows that choosing to help anyone is better than choosing to help no one, and that conscience, like rope, is only as strong as the hands that hold it. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.